Oh, here she goes. So, hey guys, it's good to be with you guys tonight. If you're new to Wednesdays at the Warehouse, or we've never had the opportunity to meet, I'm Pastor JD. And as that Brandon Lake song talked about, we're going to look at times in our lives over the next 3 weeks on Wednesdays at the Warehouse, where we're going to talk about times where it feels like all there is for us to really do is to say, can somebody please help? Can somebody please help? And that's because for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about this series called When Anxiety Attacks. When Anxiety Attacks. Anxiety is something that many people, including Brandon Lake, including me, including many of you, deal with, some of us on a daily basis, or at least in a seasonal basis. And so I thought it was time for us to tackle this huge issue that so many people deal with head on. So what is anxiety like? What is it like? Well, I kind of attribute it to kind of like an invisible bully. You know, it's like you can't see anxiety, but you can feel it. And it has this power to mess with your brain. It has the power to make your heart pound out of your chest. It has the ability to make your hands sweat. It can make tasks feel like they're insurmountable, and it can make you believe that you should procrastinate for ages and ages and that nothing is worth it because it's too difficult or it's too hard. It can keep you up at night thinking about some mistake you made in the past, or some hurt that you had in the past, or something that you're afraid about in the future. Anxiety, it takes on all sorts of forms, and it comes at the most inopportune times. And you guys know that. Whenever you have stress at school, or you start to feel like you're being overwhelmed by stuff at school, sometimes anxiety can attack. Having a conflict with someone, come on now, you know what I'm talking about whenever you say that can cause anxiety to attack. Dealing with some past hurt, some past mistake, it can make it attack. Facing the unknown, not knowing what is going to happen next and being afraid of something that is coming up in the future, or just generally feeling this uneasiness about life. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys, because most of you know exactly what I mean when I say anxiety can attack, and it can wreak havoc on your life. And so the question is if so many people deal with this thing called anxiety, this invisible bully, then what do we do about it? How do we make anxiety stop? How do we make anxiety stop? Because if you're anything like me, you know that anxiety is absolutely no fun. And if you're someone who struggles with anxiety here, or if you know someone who struggles with anxiety, I would highly suggest that you're here for the next 3 weeks, because we're going to be talking about this idea of diving into the book of Philippians that is going to show us some principles and show us some incredible truths that can help us work through this anxiety. And also, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to actually look at some psychology that is going to help us to kind of see inside of our brains a little bit and better understand where the anxiety comes from and what to do in order to help it stop. And so tonight, I want to introduce you guys to a biblical principle that can significantly help your anxiety. Whenever you feel yourself like you're being trapped in some web of negativity or depression, whenever you feel like you can't escape that cycle of doubt or that cycle of fear. And it's a principle that can help you whenever you thought, why is everything going so bad? Why does it feel like my life is falling apart? And this principle that we learn about in the book of Philippians that we're going to be studying over the next 3 weeks, it can help us break free from the shackles of hopelessness. And it works, as we will see, even when you find yourself in literal shackles, which we will talk about in just a minute. This principle that I'm talking about tonight is called the reframe principle. Everybody say reframe. Reframe, the reframe principle. So what is the reframe principle? Well, it's simple to understand, but it is far from simple to actually implement and do in your life. The reframe principle is this: it's flipping negatives into positives by having an eternal perspective. It's flipping negative thoughts into positive thoughts by having an eternal, not an immediate perspective, not where your face is right in it, but where you take a step back and you look at it from an eternal perspective. Basically, it's like putting on a pair of glasses in your brain that are different and looking at life differently than you do whenever you have anxiety. It's changing the way you think, changing what you believe. Instead of getting stuck in negative thoughts and kind of letting those things overwhelm you and as he said, like back you against a wall, the reframe principle helps you to look at the same circumstances, but they look new and they look different because you're looking at them from a higher perspective, an eternal perspective. It's the reframe principle. And because the truth is, and you know this, we can't always change our circumstances, can we? And sometimes our circumstances are not very fun, are they? They're not always the best thing in the world that we're going through. We can't control what happens to us, but I'll tell you what we can control. We can control how we view what is happening to us. That is completely within our control. You know, the Apostle Paul in the Bible, he is the master of the reframe principle. In fact, he's the one who wrote the book of Philippians, and there's this one time in his life where Paul had this huge plan. He was on fire. After his conversion and coming to Jesus, he was on fire to share the gospel. And so he had this plan that he was going to go to Rome, and he was going to spread the word to public officials and people of influence. And he believed that if he could get into Rome and share the gospel from Rome, that it would spread like wildfire, that it would literally go viral. Well, he did make it to Rome, but things didn't work out the way he thought that they would. He finally made it to Rome, but when he got there, he wasn't preaching. Instead, he was in prison. He was in prison, chained up and facing a possible execution, not knowing if his life was literally going to come to an end, not quite exactly how he envisioned it to go. But think about it. How often do you have times in your life where things don't go exactly how you thought they would go? And you're like, why? Why is this happening? Like, you think you're good in a relationship, and all of a sudden you realize that from the other person's perspective, you're not good. And anxiety attacks. Or you study like crazy for a test. Like, you're not an overly intelligent person, and so you have to work really hard in school, and you study and you study and you study, and then your grade doesn't reflect the hard work that you did, and you're disappointed, and it doesn't go to plan. Or you're coming into middle school and you're in 6th grade, or you're going into high school and you're in 9th grade as a freshman, and all you want is your plan is, I'm just going to make like one good friend. And it doesn't happen. And you feel like you're alone, and you feel like there's no one around, and you feel like you're abandoned, and anxiety attacks. See, sometimes, and you guys know what I'm talking about, sometimes life can throw unexpected pain at us in the form of conflicts, in the form of disappointments, in the form of rejection, and we didn't see it coming. And I'll tell you what, just like us, Paul understands all too well that life does not always go according to our plans. And so what Paul could have written in the book of Philippians is one thing, and I want to show you kind of my version of what he could have written in the book of Philippians, and I want to show you what he actually wrote. But what could he have written whenever he was chained up in Rome to the Philippians? He's writing this letter to them. What could he have written? He could have written this. He could have said this. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me really sucks. I wanted to spread the good news, but that didn't happen. I'm stuck in jail with a pointless existence. And because of all this unfairness, I have decided prayer doesn't work, I don't trust God, and I am never going back to church again. Based on his circumstances, he could have completely written something like that. But I want you to see the reframe principle at work in this passage. Here's what he actually does say in Philippians 1:12-14. It says, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me has helped to spread the good news. For everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. You see, Paul, he saw an opportunity in his imprisonment, instead of seeing the chains of imprisonment like so many of us see, we see the problems, we see the issues, we see the anxiety, we feel it deep within us, and we focus on the bars, we focus on the chains. Paul is in one of those circumstances. He had a chance to focus on the chains, to focus on the bars, and yet what we see him do is focus instead on the opportunity. See, he couldn't control what happened to him, but he could reframe how he viewed what was happening to him. He chose to see the bigger picture. And that, my friends, is the reframe principle at work. You know, just like many of you, I gotta be honest, there are days and there are seasons of my life whenever I feel pretty overwhelmed. I try and brush it. I mean, if you're new to the warehouse, you know that about me. I've shared that I struggle with anxiety, and but just because I share it, I want to believe that it helps that whenever I share about it, because it like relinquishes the power. But honestly, it still comes after me sometimes, and I want it to stop. And there's times in my life where I feel like there's more than I can handle, and as a result, anxiety attacks me. And it seeps into my head and it seeps into my heart. And so I'll tell you that if I'm not incredibly intentional, bad things start happening in my head and I start believing the wrong thing. I start reframing things in the most negative light possible. But what I have to do is I have to learn from the reframe principle from Paul, and I need to be intentional to turn to God to renew my mind. I have to be incredibly intentional to turn to his truth as my battle plan. Not my plans, but God's plan for the battle ahead. I have to intentionally replace the old negative thought patterns that so easily ingrain themselves in my mind with new positive ones that have eternity in mind. Now, that's not easy to do, especially when your brain creates neural pathways that are like ruts in your brain, and your brain tries to fast track it so it doesn't have to think as much. And so you start to create these ruts in your brain, so you immediately go to anxiety, you immediately go to worry, you immediately go to the worst case scenario. And so we have to fight against those neural pathways and say, no, I'm not gonna think that way anymore. I'm going to reframe my situation. I can't change what has happened to me, but I can view what is happening to me differently because of the reframe principle. So how do I do that? Well, it starts by not giving in to your old way of thinking. Like I said, those neural pathways, they're stubborn things. Your mind just wants you just to continue to do the same thing over and over again. But you can't let it. You can't conform to the pattern and the thinking of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And instead of focusing on what we see, it's focusing and fixing our thoughts on Jesus and how he wants us to see our situations and our circumstances. See, you need to remember that God created you, and if you've accepted Jesus into your heart, he has saved you. And as I talked about at Vertical Camp this past summer, the same power that saved you has the same power to sustain you every single day, through the highs and through the lows. That power is strong enough to save you for eternity. You better believe, and I better believe, that it is strong enough to sustain me through the ups and downs of my life. You know, Scripture tells us something. It says that we are not just conquerors. We're not just successful, but I want you to look at what it says. It says, no, in all these things, we are what? More than conquerors through him who loves us. What are all of these things? All these things are the circumstances of life. They're the highs and they're the lows. They're the times when you're feeling good and they're the times when you're feeling bad. You need to hear me tonight. Scripture tells us that in all things, you are more than a conqueror because of Jesus and because of his love for you. You are meant to do more than just survive. You are meant to thrive. And so, what do you say over the next 3 Wednesdays, we start to allow God to change our thinking, to rewire our brains, because when he does, it will change our life. And as Kaylee leads us in this last closing song, I want you to ask God to help you to have the strength and the courage and the discipline to reframe your mind in order to find peace from anxiety when it attacks. Let's sing.